Welcome to another edition of GVN Interview, your home for conversations with some of the best in film, television, media, and literature. On today's show, we welcome former mergers and acquisitions attorney, now strategist and media entrepreneur, Zach Abramowitz. Zach is the host of the new Next Chapter podcast, Targeted. Now here's your host, Martin Sexton.
Welcome once again to GVN Interview. I am your host, Martin, and on today's show, we welcome former attorney turned strategist and entrepreneur, Zach Abramowitz. Zach is the host for a new Next Chapter podcast, Targeted, an in-depth discussion with individuals with the courage to reveal corruption and the consequences they face from those in power. So let's welcome Zach Abramowitz to GVN Interview. Thank you for giving us a bit of your time. Zach, how you doing this evening?
Doing great. Thank you, Martin, and nice to be here.
Excellent. Okay, so before we delve into your new podcast, Targeted, I want to start with some of your background, which to me is very interesting on its own. You had a career in law under the mergers and acquisitions umbrella, but I saw that early on you performed as a stand-up comedian. So how in the world did you go from stand-up to corporate law?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think my life and my career sort of reflects this, is someone who sort of can't decide between art and business and maybe constantly tries to merge those two. Not quite a theater kid, but my senior year in university, I went, I'd never actually been to a comedy club, but I went and I heard a couple of routines. And I think this is an experience that some people have going to comedy clubs, which is, I thought, I'm funnier than they are. And, I think a lot of people sort of think it and then never do anything more with it. But I became sort of obsessed with it and went to some local comedy clubs in New York City and said, hey, I think I'm really funny. How do I do this? Like there wasn't like a manual for how to become a stand-up comic, but I did perform for about a year and a half regularly in clubs across New York City, and really did consider it as a career. And I'll tell you that when I went on job interviews, when I ultimately signed up, started working in a big law firm, I interviewed maybe with 40 different firms, and that was the thing they all wanted to talk with me about. And they all wanted to say, why did you leave stand-up comedy and come to law? And I thought it was like pretty obvious. I'm like, well, it's clearly the money, right? Like, I don't know why, like, why are we asking this? Like it's some major question here. But there were some other drawbacks I found, which was, and I performed, right before and following some of the biggest comics that you'll see today, multiple times where I performed right before Jim Gaffigan. So I was, very, very much in it. And not true of Jim, but what I found of other comics when they would come off the stage and I would kind of like, want to pick their brain for their experience, their expertise. How do they do this? I just found they were, typically speaking, like the saddest, most depressed people going. And my sort of image of the stand-up comedian had been, Jerry Seinfeld, the kind of, clean, PG-13 comic who seemed like he had it all. He seemed like he had it all together. I kind of stopped that phase and said, you know what, this is not the kind of lifestyle that I want to live. But I'd be lying to you if I said I don't think about it quite often, and sort of wonder, do I still have it? Could I still put it together? What I found is it's a completely immersive process. If you are not a stand-up comedian 24 hours a day, you're not going to succeed. And I think that's like anything. To be great at anything, you've got to be completely in it. And creating a stand-up brand is very much like starting a new company. It is not a work-life balance play.
And I imagine you talked about, the people you interviewed with wanted to talk about that, because I imagine there is a not just a great amount of courage required to put yourself out there like that. And if they know anything from that is that you're not afraid to put yourself in public and do whatever it is you
By
do.
the way, I have to jump in and just tell you
Okay.
quickly because you asked. Not only did they ask me about it, but there were a couple of attorneys who actually asked me in the interview. These were senior partners at top firms, and they asked me. They said, "Well, I want to hear the act." And so what I told them is, I said, "Listen, first of all, everyone who came to my act, it was a 2 drink minimum." Right. So I can't be funny, just on a spot with someone sober. But I said, I'll do it. But if I make you laugh, you guarantee me a callback interview. And there were some who actually held to that deal. And I think they appreciated the sort of negotiation tactic of it.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, as I said, just as an upcoming lawyer, you did some internships, and one of them was for ESPN. So how did that come
Yeah.
about, and what did you learn during that time that might have influenced your future goals?
Wow. What I learned a lot. Even when I went to law school, I was atypical. I actually, when I was in law school, what I really wanted to do was be the general manager of a major sports franchise. So I just tried as hard as I could, in addition to my legal studies, to do anything I could to network in the world of sports and entertainment. And at the time, I was listening to the Max Kellerman show. Max has since, had a big show on ESPN and was HBO boxing for years. And so I wrote him a letter. I said, listen, I've heard a couple of times on your show that you'll reference a legal issue and you'll say, well, if we had a lawyer around, we could find out an answer, but we don't. So we're just going to kind of move on. I said, I want to come be the legal intern of the Max Kellerman show. And he originally so he wrote back to me. He said, I'm not really sure, like, we've never had a legal intern. I said, that's okay. You don't need to pay me anything. All I need is a badge. And I began working, and I worked at his show. I worked also sort of as a production assistant on Stephen A. Smith's show as well. So I got exposure to some really, really talented content creators. And I would say from Max, I certainly learned the most. Of kept in touch with him over the years as well. I actually ended up representing as an agent his show producer who had started his own show, a guy named Robin Lundberg. So I stayed with it. But what I'll tell you, what I learned from that is Max always explained to me the worst thing you can be in content is vanilla. He said it's got to have, people either need to really, really like you or really, really hate you. He said the ones who don't make it are the ones who sort of get stuck in the middle. And that was a really important learning for me. I think that was, as far as content goes, when I do content, I really try to think about, like, what is going to get someone to sort of react almost physically, emotionally, feel something. And that's something that I've taken, whether that's the targeted podcast or that's a briefing that I'm giving to a legal team on AI. I'm try to create content that really makes people feel something that's not vanilla.
So you went in, you're talking about creating content. You worked as a journalist, as a columnist, excuse me, for Above the Law, and you also co-founded Reply All, and then founder of Killer Whale Strategies. So what inspired you to create Killer Whale Strategies, and what clientele were you targeting when you founded it?
As you mentioned, I left law to start a startup that actually was not really in the legal technology space at all. We were an early predecessor to Clubhouse, but our concept was to try to recreate how conversations take place online and create a kind of collaborative text-based conversation that probably might resemble a podcast, but with some of the back and forth dynamic, but wouldn't be in audio, would be in text. We layered in audio and video at some point as well, but that was the concept. It didn't have much to do with legal, except that we had a number of partnerships with legal websites that I had been able to go to as a lawyer and pitch idea, hey, listen, I want you to use this product for your writers. And with Above the Law, I actually created a lot of these conversations myself. And the first sort of conversations included, just famous people, people I knew would want to look at the conversation regardless of the new format. And so I interviewed Mark Cuban, John Grisham, Peter King from Sports Illustrated. I really tried to bring heavy hitters. And then at some point, David Latt, the then editor of Above the Law, said to me, these are conversations, they're really doing very well with our audiences. Would you be willing to do this more regularly? And at the time, I was looking for anyone that could validate our product, and our product being there with its brand on Above the Law's website was something I could take to Huffington Post, to Sports Illustrated, and to others and show them the kind of, results we were getting. But what happened as a kind of side product of that is that I needed something that I could write about. I needed something that I could converse about, could create really dynamic content. And I thought to myself, I bet that legal tech is a thing, right? This was like in the sort of post-Facebook startup craze when everyone was sort of thinking about starting a startup. They had seen The Social Network. They wanted to be, a unicorn founder, billionaire, right? So I'm thinking there's got to be something going on in legal. And in fact, when I was a lawyer, there was so much of what we did that was so monotonous. I'm guessing tech could probably solve a lot of those issues today. So I began in 2015 writing about legal technology and really getting much more invested in that world. And that was at the kind of like the nascent stage of legal technology. It was not a sexy vertical at all. But in 2018, I looked at, the company that I was working with, Reply All, and I thought, you know what? I think that what's happening in legal is actually more interesting than what we've created here. We were making money, but no one was getting filthy rich. And so I decided I'm going to start a second company with the primary goal of capitalizing on disruptive trends impacting the legal profession. And that is what we still do to this very day. I would say that since ChatGPT emerged in December of 22, it's been a massive game changer for us because today legal is one of the most impacted professions by AI. It is front and center on the mind of just about every attorney, every law firm leader. This is a very, very new area, and they're looking to people with expertise who can advise them and kind of be their Sherpa throughout the process of implementing AI and transforming their business. And that's what we do, right? We help companies, law firms, legal departments, legal service providers, everyone else sort of figure out like what are the trends? What do I need to do? Who do I need to partner with? And how are we going to explain this to our partners, to our clients, to our stakeholders? And and it's been a really exciting business for me. But a huge part of what we do is not just sort of the research, but it's also the content. It's also arming all of our, executives, all the clients that we work with to better tell the story of what's happening in AI right now, because that's as important as understanding the technology, is understanding how to explain it to others so that it actually matters.
Right, and that would make sense because AI is very controversial. Even especially even my main thing that I cover comics, and of course AI is a big deal in that phase. And some people don't want anything to do with it, and some people want to embrace it. So you're trying to basically explain to your clients how it can benefit them, I'm assuming.
You know what? We're not shy when we think that there are AI. If there's something about AI that would not just benefit but potentially be a threat to our clients, we want to
Okay.
explain that to them as well, right? So I think I'm agnostic on the question of good or is it bad,
Right.
right? I think there's good AI, there's bad AI, just like everything else. But I do sort of my sort of fundamental belief is that it's here. And the genie is already out of the bottle, and pretending like it's not for a lot of the clients that we work with is just not an option.
Right. Okay. So all of your experiences up to this point have led you to your latest endeavor, which is Targeted, a podcast that
Yep.
explores and discusses those who had the courage to challenge those in authority when they, recognize corruption or things that were going wrong, and how it also impacted their lives when they did so. So, how did this premise come about, and did you have an idea of those whose stories you might have wanted to focus on at the start?
What's unique about like the targeted podcast and the concept that we've developed is most people think about targeting is something that only happens to famous people, people in public positions, people who sort of ask for it by virtue of being out there in the public spotlight. You've sort of opened yourself up to targeting. I think the way we in society, when we think of this, whether it's cancel culture or anything else, we sort of have this, I, you know, we've come to terms with the idea that for famous and glam, this is just something that sometimes comes with the territory. What this show explores is what happens when unchecked power goes off the rails and ordinary people end up in the crosshairs. So not everyone that we're talking to on this show is famous or someone you've necessarily heard of. Even some of the famous people like Nathan Law, who's a podcast whose episode just dropped today, on the one hand, yeah, he was a Nobel Prize nominee, but most people haven't heard of Nathan Law. And most people are unaware of him. Today, he leads or tries to lead a fairly normal life, but still has to sort of live with the kind of long term effects of being targeted. So, this was really the premise for the story. And from a content perspective, I think it's something that's not been explored. I think it's an area where when you listen to some of these episodes, you listen to some of these stories, you start to think, oh my gosh, like, could this happen to me? And I think that is what's really frightening to me as an attorney and as someone who's lived in multiple countries and understands that not every country's rule of law standards are equal. And what happens in so many of these episodes is that disparity in rule of law can often lead to results that are, quite frankly, disastrous. And to see how, in some cases, being targeted really people and crush their spirit, and for other people, they came out on the other side stronger. And I think like there's no judgment, for whichever one. People have had to deal with it in multiple ways. But I think it's a very meaningful topic to me, and I'm glad we're getting to shed some light on these circumstances. One of the people that we interview later in the season, and I won't spoil it now, is someone who I knew previously who had been targeted. And I had said to him at some point, I said, "This story is madness. I've never heard of something like this. This should be optioned for a movie." And so I think this was finally an opportunity to sort of showcase some of these stories, but not just one person's, but to show that this is something that with today's tools, with today's media landscape, with today's global economy, you can really, if there's someone you want to crush, it's doable. And that's a frightening thought.
Okay, so and I would say for all your guests, during the first season, have a powerful story and they face extreme consequences for their willingness to, put themselves out there. Did any of your guests have any reluctance to, as I say, to put themselves out there again? Because, they're trying to, I assume they're trying to, get some sort of semblance of a normal life back. Did they have any issue as far as talking to you about it?
Yeah, so some of these people have not really had their story, fully told. So it wasn't the first time. It was the first time for them, and I think there was definitely some hesitation. One of the guests we spoke to later in the series is someone who, if you went searching on social media, you'd never find him. Has never done a podcast interview, had never, and yet he's had to deal with this incredibly difficult circumstances of being targeted, personally and professionally. But the challenge from a content creator's perspective is this is someone who's has zero media training, has never is not necessarily has never been on a podcast, probably will never go on a podcast, and that I think was that was something that I had to think about very carefully, like how are we going to effectively tell the story of people who are not storytellers. So that was one on the one side. Nathan Law, who I mentioned, was very hesitant to talk more about this. And ultimately what we explained to him was we said, listen, we're okay with the fact that you're hesitant to talk about this. That's what we'd like to capture. So if there's an answer if there's a question I ask and you can't answer it, saying I can't answer that is almost, as informative as if you would actually give me the answer. You're being real with it. So that, I think it was certainly, it's a challenge for some. Others, have stared danger right in the eyes and lived to tell about it. And I think are just sort of like fearless, maybe because of the experience or in spite of the experience, just it's how their DNA is wired.
And so when you approach these people, and I don't know if this is actually a thing or not, but did the representatives or themselves, did they set you any ground rules of what they would or couldn't talk about? Or was it just a matter if they didn't want to talk about it, they would just told you they would not comment on that?
Oh man, you can't tell me you don't want to talk about something and then come on for an interview with me. If you're there, we're talking.
Targeted presents an honest, truth be known, sometimes scary portrait of what those in power will do to protect their secrets. It's kind of both a cautionary tale and a profile in courage for those willing to buck the system. So, what would you hope that your watchers or listeners would come away with at the end of each of your episodes?
That's a great question, and I think to me, there's no, you can't hear it enough. Don't believe everything you read online. You've got to still approach, whether it's in some, third-rate periodical you've never heard of, or if it's in the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times, you need to constantly have a healthy amount of skepticism about what it is, about the content that you consume online. And I think that was, for me, like one of the biggest learnings is realizing, just because there are 1, 2, 3, 4 articles about a person that tell you here's what happened and here's the story, what you find when you really dig deep into some of the, into the research and look at these stories with a fresh pair of eyes is, wow, like this person, got totally done dirty. I mean, like that to me is, I think, one of the biggest things that I hope people take away. I hope people understand that this is something that can happen. And I think that if we don't figure out quickly some way to regulate the disparity in, rule of law in different governments, like we're going to have a really, really hard time, and this is going to happen to more people, right? Again, the genie is out of the bottle. We talked about AI, but in terms of being able to go out and target someone, there is a roadmap, there's a blueprint for doing it. That's, quite frankly, like really frightening when you understand like what has happened to some of the people. I don't have any stats on like how often taking place, how many people will get targeted, but I think if we don't figure out some way to deal with this is the kind of thing that could continue, to really develop in a kind of unhealthy way.
Kind of as a follow-up to this, we've talked about what you want your guests to learn from it. You yourself, as as you went into this podcast and did your research, have you been surprised about what you found out about human nature and maybe what people on both sides of the coin are capable of?
Well, listen, I'm a lawyer, so I've, I have. There's not a lot that I've seen at this point that surprises me. However, it's good to be reminded that people who are in a struggle, and especially when it's over power or money, will very often use, unfortunately, whatever they have at their disposal, right? So whether that's a kind of weak claim that they rely on, or whether that's an army of bloggers that can, write that can write false stories and disseminate mis and disinformation. People will do that, and I think that's sort of like, my bigger takeaway about humans is you put humans in a conflict situation, whether they are targeting or being targeted, and they will use whatever resources they have at their disposal.
Very well said. Okay, well, I want to thank you for spending some time with us, Zach. But before I let you go, I want you to please remind our fans about Targeted and where they can go to listen.
Fantastic. So they can listen, first of all, at targeted.com, the website. They can also find us on YouTube, and they can find us on Twitter at targeted.com, on Instagram at targeted.com, and you can follow me at Zach Abramowitz on X and on Instagram as well. And I really hope everyone gets a chance to check out the podcast, because a lot of work went into it, and it's something we're very proud of.
All right, very good. Well, I thank you again, Zach, and I will be following the podcast along, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk to you here in the future.
Would appreciate that. Thank you so much, Martin. Great to meet
All
you.
right, thank you. Nice to meet you too.
Thank you for watching this edition of GVN Interview, your home for conversations with some of the best in film, television, media, and literature. GVN Interview is a production of Geek Vibes Nation.